welcome, good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Chiara Ricciardone. I'm the Clemens von Klemperer postdoctoral fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center, and it's such a pleasure to be opening up this Tough Talks. This is a student-run series, as you might know, and I'm seeing people trickling in. So this is a student-run series that aims to make space on Bard's campus for perspectives that might otherwise be unheard or muted. And as such, it's something that the Hannah Arendt Center is really delighted to host, and we're really proud of our student fellows. So tonight I have Max Clevado here. He's a junior political science major from the Evergreen State. And he said that he's been influenced by his father's reading of Hannah Arendt to join the center. So he has invited our speaker tonight and will be moderating tonight. So Max, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So just a little bit of a blurb, but the Hannah Arendt Center created the Tough Talk series to challenge our community preconceptions by introducing speakers who have alternative perspectives and controversial ideas to the Bard community. We wanted to expand how our community thinks as a means to encourage all of us to hold ourselves accountable for the way we think. In the spirit of this, we wanted to invite Bhaskar Sunkara to speak as part of the Tough Talk series because of his work on how alternative means of organizing government and economics, specifically socialism, can offer both freedom and prosperity for people living in contemporary society. Bhaskar Sunkara is a writer who was the founding editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine, which was created to be a voice for the American left. Bhaskar is also the author of the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics and the Narrative of Extreme Inequality, which was published in 2019. He has also done work as a columnist for The Guardian and has been an editor for the other works like The Future We Want, Radical Ideas for the New Century. In addition, he has worked as a publisher of the London Tribune and The Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. Today, Bhaskar's talk, The Socialist Manifesto, will focus on the resurgence of democratic socialism in the United States. And despite its checkered history, there's real evidence of its success in the democratic countries. So thank you all so much for being here, and I will let Bhaskar get started.
Well, first of all, thank you to Max and to everyone at the center for the invitation to do the talk. So obviously I'm here to talk about socialism. I was asked to talk about socialism, which in a way is progress. I think for any of you who've had any experience on the American left, for a lot of at least my time as a socialist, so I'm 31 now, I became active in the organized socialist movement when I was maybe 17 years old. You would have to really annoy people to talk to them about socialism. You would have to like stand at an anti-war protest, hawking a newspaper, or like make a caustic intervention at a city council meeting. Like it would be very difficult. So here we are in 2021 and people are actually soliciting talks about socialism. So obviously after years of being relegated to the margins of American political life, after years of being associated with the cruel dictatorships of the Soviet bloc, people are once again talking about the S word in the US. And we've just had a major presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders, who's a self-described democratic socialist. He attracted the support of millions of people based on a message that whatever you think about its particularly socialist credentials, I'm obviously a fan. It was based around attacking inequality and railing against billionaires and millionaires. We have new thinkers and organizations broadly pushing socialist ideas. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I mentioned before that I joined DSA when I was 17. At the time, the organization had around 5,000 people. I would say the majority of them, at least the ones I interacted with, were over 60. And now we have an organization of maybe, I think the last mark like 92 or 93,000 members. Still, there's a lot of vagueness and imprecision about what it means to be a socialist, what socialists want, how we want to achieve it. And what I would say is that I obviously am not the arbiter of what every socialist thinks, but I do believe I have a fairly ecumenical vision of what socialism is, and I could lay out the broad contours of the socialist worldview and maybe answer some questions about it. So I guess to begin with, the important caveat is that democratic socialists do not aspire to, take all of your stuff. We don't aspire to have you stand in line for toothbrushes or for bread. We think there's a difference between personal property, like your right to own a car or have other nice things, and what we define as private property. So the right of a small group of people, capitalists, to own productive assets. So the businesses, the firms in a society, because it means that we're forced to work for them without a democratic say in the matter. And I'll get into the complications of that a little bit later. But I would say that the core democratic socialists believe profoundly in the importance of the individual and the idea that our individuality can only be developed in society, embodying the values of liberty, of equality, and of solidarity. So that means recognizing that in many ways, each and every one of us is different and unique, but we can only all develop these unique abilities in a different sort of society, a society where inequalities are tackled, so we have a truly fair shot at life. So this would mean, in the least, a society able to socially provide everyone with certain core necessities, so food, housing, education, healthcare, childcare, to allow individual flourishing. The scientist Stephen Jay Gould, who himself was a socialist, said that he was less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talents have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. I am, in fact, interested in the convolutions of Einstein's brain, but I, certainly subscribe to the broader sentiment. And in a similar vein, obviously, Marx, in one of his more famous quotes, said that he wanted a society in which the free development of each is conditioned for the free development of all. So a society, in other words, where the success of one person empowers another to reach their own potential. But ultimately, what I'm laying out, and what I will lay out, the socialist dream is meant to be a modest one. We don't aspire for a utopia, but at the very least, we aspire to a society where people, regardless of the circumstance of their birth, can live productive lives, can reach their potentials, and can ultimately at least have the shot to pursue happiness. And in other words, one anti-utopian way to put it would be, and this was coined by Berkeley College professor Corey Robin. He said that his vision of socialism was turning excruciating misery into ordinary unhappiness. And Sidney Hook, the famous philosopher of the 20th century, back when he was a Marxist and actually one of our finest minds in the 1930s from the anti-Stalinist left. For him, he said that socialism was about solving our animal problems so that we could begin to start solving our human problems. So we want democracy, insofar as it exists today, in the political realm where it does exist, to be defended, but also expanded into social and economic realms as well. So we want people to have a democratic say over the forces that govern their lives and their workplaces and the communities and in their homes. And since wealth is socially created, we think everybody has the right to have some sort of say over the how the spoils of their labor are dealt with. So it's worth noting that we live in a world that has already achieved many of the goals of the workers' movement set out to achieve in its modern birth in the mid-19th century. So often I think we could be really depressed and dejected about the state of the world, and we could forget that we're not living in the worst of all possible worlds. We're living in a world that has already been profoundly shaped by the workers' movement and other democratic movements. We live in a world where, for example, despite all the corporate attacks on public education, I bet that if you poll supporters of the Tea Party or the modern kind of libertarian part of the Republican Party, a majority of them would probably acknowledge the right of every person, regardless of their life circumstance, to be given primary education, to be literate. You know, they might want this education to be like funded through a complex like voucher system or whatever else, but I think they would concede that. So education is, in a sense, at that basic level, even the United States, though it's under constant attack, decommodified. It's taken out of the sphere of the market. And despite all of its inequities, it's something broadly acknowledged and enshrined as a social right. So a socialist would ask, though, if everyone has the right to read just by virtue of being born, why wouldn't that right apply to having 3 decent meals to eat? You know, it's hard to read and study if you're suffering from hunger, or to have a good, affordable place to live. So we propose that the more spheres of life be taken out of the domain of the market and be enjoyed by people with social rights just by virtue of being born, and that these people in turn will have the opportunity to develop their capabilities, reach their creative potentials, live fulfilling lives, and benefit society in such a way that other people will be able to do the same. So this kind of politics, socialists think, are in the interest of the vast majority of people, and our goal is to try to help organize people to turn these abstract interests into concrete politics, and oppose what we think is just the tiny minority of people who benefit from the status quo, from the division of society into what in the Marxist worldview is exploiting and exploited classes. So the argument we make is that it's technically possible to build a better world. It's just politically very hard because of the forces arrayed against this vast majority, what socialists call the working class. Many of those who don't, the vast majority of us who don't own factories and businesses, who have to sell our ability to labor because we have no other way to survive. And you know, it's a society in which our capability to resist is always going to be limited because because of a fundamental collective action a problem. So this is something I'll get into later, but if you're unemployed, it is not rational for you to seek a political redress to your problem. It is rational for you to try to get another job, for you to rely on friends and family and kinship networks, and for you to keep your head down and hope that things change. So the way that I see it is that socialists, our goal isn't necessarily to lead change from above, but it's rather to create the infrastructures of dissent that make collective action a more viable option for people in more situations. And obviously there was a time in the United States when politics and when collective action seemed a more viable route to the improvement of your life. So around a century ago in cities across New York State, for example, in cities like Schenectady, in Troy, it's relatively close to Bard. Bard is near like Rhinebeck, right? Anyway, somewhat in the neighborhood. I'm actually from the Hudson Valley, so I should know. Like now that I think of it, I don't actually know where Bard is. So somewhere in that vague vicinity, you know, there were socialist mayors at the turn of the 20th century. You know, we had Socialist Party of America branches all over the place. It was a budding mass party in certain parts of the country, like in the garment district of the Lower East Side, like in mining towns in the West, in places like Nevada and Oklahoma. It was actually a mass political force. And, you know, again, you know, though it seems like the legacy of socialism and the broader labor movement in the United States is a failure, that isn't exactly the case. God, if you believe in God, even in the scripture, rested on the 7th day. Most of us, hopefully, get the 6th day off too. That unequivocally is a secular accomplishment of the workers' movement. So everything from Saturdays to the 8-hour workday, to struggles for women's suffrage, to civil rights for Black Americans, reproductive rights, the movement for gay marriage, beyond. Socialists have been at the forefront of all of these movements, all of these small democratic movements of the past 120 years. And I think on the right side of history. And I think actually a lot of liberal Americans would acknowledge that. But the case I'm making is a little more of a difficult case. The case I'm making is not simply that socialists can bear witness and push American liberalism to do better things, but I'm making the case that socialism as a goal is in and of itself a goal that would improve the lives of the vast majority, despite the historical record of socialism in the 20th century. So the point that I want to emphasize, though, is that there's nothing inherently natural about a democratic capitalism. You know, I would concede, of course, that we live in a broadly democratic society, a society where certain rights are enshrined. But capitalism in and of itself is a system of exploitation and class division. The democracy that we have, the democracy that we should respect and enhance, was foisted upon capitalists against their wishes by popular struggle. If you want to complicate the question, you could say that the material abundance created by capitalism, the surplus created by capitalism, makes it easier in a way, despite the resistance of these elites, to have a more democratic society. But democracy in and of itself did not naturally arise hand in hand with capitalism. So our opposition as socialists to capitalist democracy isn't due to the democratic rights it extends, but the ones it limits. Freedom of speech, for example, is severely constricted in society with maldistributed wealth and power. In a country like India, for instance, India is, despite the Modi government, its rightward shift, it is still a democratic country. It still has enshrined rights like a free press and free speech. But it's a country with a free press and with also, I don't know the exact amount, but 40% of the country functionally illiterate. So again, a socialist stance isn't the knee-jerk rejection of liberal rights and saying that this is a fake right, but it's rather saying this is a right that can only be truly actualized if it's paired with other social guarantees, like the right to a functioning education, like the end to child labor, like all these other things. And obviously, you know, needless to say, you know, you could also see the irony of Stalinist dictatorships that were run in the name of socialism, because not only did they not radically expand democracy, they didn't even afford workers the democratic rights they enjoy in capitalist democracies. That's one reason why democratic socialists have always opposed them. Some called them bureaucratic collectivist societies, some called them state capitalist societies. I would just say that, you know, I wouldn't fight you if you wanted to call them socialists, but I would call them bad societies, so maybe bad socialist societies or whatever else. So again, the little bit of humanity we have in your society, Social Security, Medicare, other basic protections, these were all advocated by broad left coalitions the socialists had a part in. And again, the doses of socialism within capitalism that we do have is something that we should be proud of. And again, the routes are not too complicated to see. So often when people talk about the welfare state, they think about the greatest examples of the welfare state, like in Northern Europe and Sweden and elsewhere. And often you'll see commentators in places like Ford and the Financial Times say, yes, but wait, these are capitalist societies, not social societies. Yeah, I would just remind you that Sweden in the 1910s was probably the most unequal, short of Tsarist Russia, the most unequal society in Europe. And not only was it incredibly unequal, incredibly undemocratic, the workers in Sweden had something that was referred to in the capitalist press all around the world as the Swedish disease. They were always on strike, they were always revolting. There was a huge amount of turmoil, and that's because they were organized in two major forces. One was this mass industrial trade union federation, the LL, and the other was the SAP, the Swedish Workers' Party, often we translate into English as the Swedish Social Democratic Party, which was programmatically Marxist. It was built along the same lines as the other Marxist parties that emerged in the Second International of 1889, a formation that included the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which later gave birth to both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. So these were socialists that took power, that were able to win political democracy and ruled basically without interruption from the early 1930s until 1976, either alone in coalition with an agrarian party or with the Communist Party. But again, obviously they only managed in practice to deliver doses of socialism within capitalism, but programmatically they were socialist parties. And again, the welfare state in that case was directly constructed, and it's like paradigm. It's best example in Northern Europe by self-described socialist parties. In other countries where extensive welfare states, far greater than what we have in the US, was constructed. It was constructed with socialists in either junior partners or as the main opposition force. So in Italy, the main opposition force during the construction of a lot of the post-war republic. In Germany as the main opposition force to the Christian Democrats, and in the US with the New Deal coalition with socialists at certain key moments of advance in the 1930s and the 1960s, playing a major role as either a junior partner in a coalition or in opposition, pushing forward that movement. So for socialists, of course, and what I'm advocating isn't just a defense of the welfare state, it's a call to go beyond it. So our problem isn't just that people don't have enough of an opportunity to live a good life, because one can imagine a society, again, something close to what the Scandinavian welfare states came close to achieving in the 20th century, in which basic needs are met, but that fall short of our democratic expectations as socialists of what a good society should look like. So we could think for a second about what this would mean. So socialists by nature, by habit, by the tradition, avoid writing out detailed blueprints. Marx had this line about not wanting to write cookshops, recipes for the cookshops of the future. It was a rebellion against what had been the socialist movement pre-Marx, which was very utopian, kind of lots of sketches of models of the new man that would emerge at certain communes and things like that. I think, though, given the manifest failures of state socialism in the 20th century, it's worth now convincing people that socialism is not only politically possible, but that it's technically possible as well. So I wanted to lay out something of a vision of what a socialist society could look like. But to begin with, I want to lay out the basis of just why in the world one would advocate for a different property relations than capitalism, when we've seen in the past certain impressive gains be made in the case of social democracies, for example, within the capitalist framework. So I would say that fundamentally it's worth remembering that socialism is based on a moral and ethical core. This, despite a lot of pretenses that some socialists have. They call themselves scientific socialists. They used to say many decades ago they were following kind of the science of dialectic materialism or whatnot. But fundamentally, it's based on something moral and ethical, which is socialist politics, the dream of overcoming hierarchy and inequality and constructing a different and more democratic society, doesn't make sense unless you believe that there's something inherently wrong with hierarchy and inequality. And that's a moral judgment. You could disagree with me on that. I would say, obviously, that those historically standing for more democracy, more rights, more exerting more concern with the social position of the marginalized, have been, I think, vindicated in future generations. I think there's a lot of forms of inequity that have seemed natural and unchangeable at the time, and later seem absurd and grotesque. But this opposition to hierarchy, to exploitation, to the domination of some people by some other people, I think is something I guess we get into. You could maybe justify it in a certain understanding of human nature, if you want this objection. I think in a social society, by the way, I keep mentioning hierarchy, I do think there'll be a need for some inequality, for some division of labor, I think in all cases, though, those inequalities, those divisions of labors would have to be democratically justified. They would have to be subjected to certain forms of oversight that they're not now. But again, there are certain forms of extreme hierarchy, extreme exploitation that there's a consensus that 99.99% of Americans, I would hope even the most right-wing and fringe Americans would reject slavery as a type of production, because it's clearly and manifestly extreme and unjust system. Again, the socialist case, the normative case, is that wage labor constitutes an unjust system. And again, there's many complicated cases the socialists have made against this, but I would say that simply it's rooted in a moral and ethical objection to forms of exploitation. And again, the simple way that socialists have described what we mean by exploitation is something that that smacks close to the classic economist labor theory of value. I don't actually subscribe to the labor theory of value in particular, but I think it presents a useful construct to think about what we're talking about. So in other words, it's a framework that might explain something. So again, this is a sketch. I'm not making some sort of grand stance in defense of the labor theory of value. I think a lot of being a socialist is perfectly compatible with being a left marginalist. That's kind of a conversation for a different talk. But let's say you're getting paid maybe $10 an hour by a boss, by a capitalist in a stable, profitable firm. You've been working there for 5 years. You work around 60 hours a week. Given no other information, we can probably deduce one thing from this example. So $10, 5 years, 60 hours a week. Your labor is probably producing more than $10 an hour for your boss. And again, I am allotting all sorts of complications. It's meant as an abstract example. So in the classic Marxist conception, the difference between what you're producing and what you're getting back is considered exploitation. Again, a little bit more complicated than that. So it's what you're producing and your cost of reproduction, and what you're getting back is exploitation. So in a socialist society, even if you're still operating with the market in certain spheres, like for consumer goods, a model of a society that you could say would be non-exploitative would be one in which you and your fellow workers could get back more of the value of your work. So that could mean more money and more material comfort as a result. It could also mean deciding to work less and get paid more for all the hours you work. So in other words, if you're working in a worker-controlled firm and you have an elected management, you're not necessarily getting exploited less in the sense that you're necessarily taking home more of your labor and dividends, but you are owning equity in the firm. You do have more oversight over what happens, work processes and things like that. And again, this is a way to create a less exploitative and less alienated workforce. So the point is that these things in our workforces can be democratically and deliberatively managed. And to the extent management is needed, their function and relationship to workers would change dramatically based on having more democratic oversight, having pay gradients decided upon, having managers elected to 2 and 3 terms, having, instead of a cast of of people who might not work at all, kind of top tier people who just might own the firm and then hire managers to oversee it. You would have more worker direct control over production. So you have that at the sphere of production. Then you have certain social rights and guaranteed, something like a slightly improved Sweden. 1974 Sweden, where you have housing access guaranteed through a combination of reforms to make the private housing market cheaper, plus a massive influx of public housing. You have guarantees to healthcare. You have free public education. You have that ability, in other words, to live a decent life without engaging in production. Then where you still have a private sector, instead of having the existing kind of tyranny of capitalist ownership, you're subjecting managerial functions and other necessary, perhaps, divisions of labor to democratic oversight. So if you were to say that one of the major problems with state social societies with command economies in the past was that, one, the price calculation problem, it was planners would dictate basically how much should be produced in raw terms, where it should be directed. Prices basically had no real functions. You created a society in which it was very hard to guarantee that the quantitative output, even if it was being met out of these state-owned firms, was things were produced effectively, or that it were the things that consumers wanted. So you avoid all that by having a market mechanism. You also avoid certain incentive problems. So if you have a full employment economy with state ownership of the means of production, like in a state social society, then, as the old Soviet joke went, people would pretend to work and the state would pretend to pay them extremely low levels of labor productivity. What I'm proposing is a society in which people have more stake in the output and efficiencies of their firm, because far from being regular salaried or wage employees, they're now given some sort of equity or stake in their firm. Plus a society in which the market function, including firm failure, is still allowed to exist elsewhere. But unlike in a capitalist society where firm failure means destitution and unemployment, there'll be in a large state sector to help either retrain people and put them into new sectors through something, again, that doesn't require a huge leap, but already exists in much of the world, like active labor market policies, or through just being absorbed into a larger state sector that provides certain goods and services like childcare and other things that are currently done by the private market. So again, I'm not saying two things that I think is often caricatured as socialists saying. One, socialists are often caricatured as saying that capitalism is a zero-sum game. I do not believe that capitalist production is a zero-sum game. By nature, in the Marxist conception of capitalism, we can't think of it as a zero-sum game because workers are producing surplus. They're producing society's wealth, and society is getting wealthier as a result. If workers were not doing anything useful or productive, then society would be getting poorer. It's manifestly not getting poorer. In the Western world, certain of our social indicators actually look worse than they did a few decades ago. Life expectancy, deaths of despair, and so on. In the world as a whole, I don't exactly agree with his rationale of how he gets there, but I think Steven Pinker is pretty much right that this is probably the best that we've done humanity in terms of the peace and prosperity in the world. Capitalist development is still clearly a dynamic force that's reducing poverty in places like Brazil and India and China and elsewhere. Now, what socialists argue is that one, the exploitative nature of this capitalist development can be replaced by another form of development based upon worker ownership and a greater role for a democratic state that is not quite so unequal and destructive, and also, of course, can have a greater role for planning as far as the natural monopolies at the commanding heights, like planning our energy grid, so it's not just a decentralized, privatized mess, so we don't get what we just had in Texas. Planning our healthcare system, so there's less redundancy, and so on. Using a greater state role to foster a transition to renewable energies. So we believe that there's a different and better system, but that doesn't mean that under the existing system, it's a zero-sum game. So as capitalists benefit, workers are necessarily getting poorer or more and more immiserated. But what is a zero-sum game in the capitalist system is autonomy and power on the shop floor. So control over labor processes between capital and labor, who gets to dictate the conditions in which people work, that is a zero-sum game. If workers are unionized and they have more power over how they conduct and organize their work, how many breaks they take or whatever else, that's power that they're taking from capitalists. If a left of center government tells capitalists that the workday is now limited to 8 hours, but a capitalist has all this fixed machinery and used to have people work voluntarily, in a sense, 11 hours or 12 hours, that's an intrusion on the rights of capital. That's limiting their freedom of capitalists, and that's giving more freedom perhaps to workers who are getting paid the same as they were when they're working 11 hours, but now they're working 8, so they have 3 extra hours for leisure, for their family, for whatever else. This is the part of it that is a zero-sum game. And I would say in that vein that often people on the left have subscribed to a kind of Hayekian discourse in a way in which they say that they aim for greater equality and less freedom, or in a sense that they kind of agree with that, the way the Hayekians would phrase the debate between socialists and advocates of capitalism, which is that socialists value equality, the Hayekians value freedom, and the irony is that with greater economic freedom, we would end up with more social goods and more consumer goods for the poor anyway. The way I would put it is that fundamentally socialism is about freedom, but it's also about the question of freedom for whom? Freedom for the person who owns that firm that wants to employ people for 10, 11 hours, or freedom for the people who work there, who want to work less hours and still get paid the same. Freedom for the rights of private capitalists to be able to do more of what they want with their private property, or freedom for the people who have no choice but to work for them. I would also say that, socialists also do believe that capitalists contribute something to production. So in socialist propaganda through the ages, capitalists are often depicted as parasites, as leeches, as kind of, in all these terms, which again makes sense as kind of basic propagandistic terms. But I would say in reality, most socialists realize that capitalists contribute a lot to production. So for one thing, entrepreneurial risk is a real contribution. And also a lot of capitalists aren't just passive owners. It's very easy to criticize capitalists who just inherit something and own wealth and live lives of leisure while they make money off other people's labor. But in fact, a lot of capitalists actually participate directly in society, and managing is actually work, creating different structures for workflow, finding new opportunities and new markets. This is all work to a degree. I think the socialist argument is that these functions aren't entirely isn't that these functions aren't productive. It's that workers can collectively handle those functions. So, for example, if you have a system of socialized finance through public banks, for instance, firms could start up and open new firms. They could expand existing firms through worker-owned firms, making applications to state banks for lines of credit, for instance. It doesn't have to be any more revolutionary than that, and the banks can assess what they're doing. Let's say not even factoring anything else, but the firm's profitability and the firm's expected ability to repay their loans on the terms given. That requires, obviously, a plan, coming up with a plan. That requires finding a source of finance. That all that, as I described it, doesn't require capitalists. Managerial aspect. Well, again, I do believe, I'm very anti-utopian socialist. I do believe that human beings will forever be alienated in industrial society. A lot of what Marx in his early philosophical writings, like the 1844 manuscripts, was talking about, the alienation of labor in industrial societies, and I think that smacks true as a philosophical concept. I think a lot of that is rooted more in the condition of advanced industrial societies and less in the particularities of capitalist ownership itself. So if we do have this division of labor, if we do have this need for managers and specializations, then I think what we would say is that, well, workers can control more of the conditions in which they're exploited in this way. Workers can, I wouldn't say exploited, actually. Workers can control more of the conditions in which they labor and they deal with these alienated conditions. So you have elected managers who have to operate by a certain firm agreement that's democratically deliberated by the workers at that firm. You might have at certain workplaces the requirement for job rotations, which again might seem completely irrational. Why should a manager spend time on the floor, a day or two a month? Why should a line worker spend time learning how to be a manager? In fact, I think not only is it more democratic and more egalitarian, but it also helps people learn more about the companies that they work at. I think there's a lot of added benefits to that too. But all these things can be implemented. And again, the idea that managers are elected and have some sort of democratic accountability to the workforce, and that certain trade-offs are democratic deliberated about, I think is quite important. And again, I kind of don't envision this completely as a laissez-faire thing where you just have firms competing with each other in kind of an anarchic way, even though I think firm failure is very important. Obviously, you would want to shape the way in which this competition happens through some sort of indicative planning, some sort of state role shaping the long-term investments of society as a whole. So maybe the state is subsidizing certain clean energy sectors of the economy and whatnot. But again, this doesn't require a massive leap into the unknown. This is what existing capitalist states do a lot. This is what states like France does to shape its long-term development. It isn't a tremendous leap. But you can imagine, for example, deliberations and debates in a workplace over, do we expand or not? Do we adopt this new technology or not? Do we take more dividends? Or do we self-finance investments into the firm? I think there's a lot of things in which people have capabilities to think through these questions that they're not currently using. So, I think it makes sense maybe to just recap some key points of what I was of what I've said about what socialism is and what some models of socialism could look like. So one, socialism at a minimum has to mean a society where people can reach their potentials and life outcomes aren't hostage to accidents of birth. That requires, in my mind, the decommodification of key social goods, and that necessitates an enlarged welfare state. I would say on this first point, existing social democracies came quite close to achieving what we would call this basic demand of socialists. These social democracies, however, have experienced, we shouldn't overstate how much, they have experienced some retrenchment of the welfare state. Many of those rights are imperiled. We've seen the retreat of welfare states all across the Western world since the 1970s. Now, we've created societies in which our welfare states were funded by the activities of private capitalists and depended on taxing profitable capitalist firms. That gave capitalists tremendous leverage to be able to, when the investment climate shifted, when their profitability started stalling out in the 1970s, to be able to say, we won't invest more unless we're given a more favorable business environment, unless unions are made weaker, unless regulation is cut down, unless workers are less militant. So in other words, I would argue that if you want to sustain a expansive welfare state, it is very difficult to do so within capitalism. Though we have seen at certain moments capitalism achieve these firms. In part, it's very difficult to sustain these gains because a expansive welfare state also happens to make workers very militant. If you are getting paid $10 an hour and you don't like your boss and you're in a condition of 15% unemployment, you probably will keep your mouth shut. If you are getting paid $10 an hour and you don't like your boss and you're in a condition of in a state with 1% unemployment and with extremely low unemployment in your sector, it'll make it a lot more viable for you and your coworkers to start a union, or if you have a union, to go on strike. Ironically, when people talk, especially liberals talk about neoliberalism, they often talk about it as an assault rooted in the thinking of Milton Friedman and the thinking of some capitalist ideologues and on some greedy kind of Reaganite capitalists who decided to go on an offensive. I think you'll find that in many cases, the post-war compromise wasn't broken by capitalists or by right-wingers, but it was broken by labor. In countries like Sweden, by the late 60s, workers are starting to demand industrial rights that go beyond wages and basic labor conditions. They're starting to otherwise question the right of managers to manage. In other countries, there's wage demands that might have been extortionate relative to the profitability of firms. I think as a socialist, these are all great things. Workers gaining more and more power and confidence and starting to demand new forms of democratic control and rights and so on. But it became very difficult for capitalists to say they're going to continue to invest in a climate where they felt like they were losing control. I think that was the root of a lot of retreat of the welfare state. So I think we have to deal with this dilemma, which even if you consider yourself a social democrat and that's all you want to achieve, that first thing that I just said, you might need to consider that we might need to go beyond social democracy to actually achieve those rights permanently. So second of all, socialism in my mind means an expansion of democracy. So that means allowing workers at the firm level more voice and more exit on the job. So voice is in democratic rights, exit as in the ability to leave that job and find comparable or otherwise rewarding work if they don't want to leave, and the creation of organs of popular participation on long-term investment plans and other economic issues at the regional and national level. Obviously, one of the great challenges of any democratic society is the reconciliation of expertise and democracy. You know, these are all complicated questions. I think it's suffice to say that socialists believe that people have more capabilities to have informed discussions and debates and participate in these debates than they're currently given on a host of issues. Though obviously, again, with both firm level democracy and with these greater democratic inputs, there needs to be a reconciliation of our forms of representative and direct democracy. I don't think these are necessarily easy questions. Along the same lines, I think it's important to note and reiterate that socialists today have essentially, I believe, reconciled socialism with certain key liberal insights. So while socialists reject the liberal emphasis on private property rights, we do, and I think this has always been true of the democratic socialists in the US, but I think socialists across the world are increasingly recognizing the need for free speech rights, for a free civil society, the liberal values like tolerance and pluralism, the permanence of politics even after the end of class antagonisms are done away with. You know, the need for example, if we have to figure out how to cross the Hudson River, and I want to build a bridge and you want to build a tunnel, which has all sorts of different impacts, that's a debate that will happen even after capitalism is over, even after class is eroded. So even the I think dream of a withering away of the state, you know, needs to take into account the permanence of politics and the need for institutions to facilitate peaceful debates. And I think in the same way, increasingly a lot of liberals of more egalitarian bent are recognizing the way in which the rights they rightly value will not be realized unless there's action through collective politics to guarantee certain economic and social outcomes. Fourth, you know, again, like I mentioned before, it's not freedom versus equality, I think, of the socialist worldview. It's freedom versus freedom, the question of freedom for whom, autonomy for whom. And fifth, again, I mentioned the acknowledgement of the failure of command economies and the old system of centralized planning, which again is sometimes somewhat of a misnomer considering how dysfunctional those systems were. They were you know, not very well planned to begin with, which suffered from both calculation and incentive problems. Whatever complaints you might have about my rough sketch of a system in which there's an expanded state sectors and maybe monopolies, natural monopolies nationalized, but firms generally run through operated along the lines of a profit motive and in a competitive market economy, except with worker ownership. At the very least, all these things are taking elements of what we already know works. Social democracy, we've seen work. We've seen worker cooperatives work. And if they do suffer from problems, which I'm sure they will, it won't be the same problems of price calculation because the market is retained, or the same problems of worker incentives, because at least here, the incentive structure is even more so than under a capitalist firm. You know, very few firms, I think, offer profit sharing. Some do, but even more directly meant to incentivize productivity. If anything, I think the real danger in such a society is self-exploitation and the need to prevent worker-owned firms from violating maybe state-mandated labor laws in the collective pursuit of more market share or more money. I certainly come from at least an immigrant family where in the quest to, I think, get a foothold in America, I think both my parents working 60, 70 hours. I imagine if you give people their own firm, much like a lot of small business owners, you might see a lot of self-exploitation. So finally, I think the thing I would say is that, I've talked a lot, a little bit more unusually so, and I do apologize. Some of that was a little bit less smooth than most of my talks, in part because I was giving you some new material. Normally there was a talk I gave from like 2015 to 2018. I decided to quickly write something new, so I'll have to refine it a bit. But a lot of what I talked about was a very abstract vision of a world after capitalism, because I think socialists don't often talk about that enough. They decry the very obvious and evident inequalities they see in the world. The fact that we take for granted the fact that if you're born in, Fairfield County, Connecticut, you're going to have a very different life than a kid born in Waterbury or Hartford. We take that for granted. That doesn't need to be the case, obviously. So all these existing inequalities, racial inequalities, sexism, all these things in our society, I could have listed a litany of what's wrong. I think, though, it is fairly obvious what's wrong, especially among what I would imagine, I don't want to assume, is a broadly progressive, public of a few dozen people who would want to hear a socialist on a Tuesday night. But I do think it's important that we start debating and talking about what a vision of a world after capitalism would look like. But obviously this would just be a pie in the sky, like very academic discussion, unless this vision was connected to an actual social force and actual day-to-day politics. So the core of what most democratic socialists in America do today is advocate around key demands like Medicare for all, key demands like a jobs guarantee, key demands like an increased minimum wage. These aren't separate fights from the fights for an actually socialist society. I believe these are fights that will help create a political coalition that will fight for something, will fight potentially for more expansive reforms. If you are living in a society in which a workers' movement, a left of center movement, doesn't have the class power to win Medicare for all, chances are discussion about who should own the means of production will be off the table. But often what we've found is that in societies in which there's been a broad-based movement that's managed to actually accomplish things like winning a expansive welfare state, winning certain labor and social rights, these have been societies where before long, these questions of ownership have also been on the table. It might be, and I would imagine that any future egalitarian movement in America won't use the same type of fairly orthodox and doctrinaire Marxist language that I use. It might speak in more populist idioms. Populism, by the way, has its roots and its modern form, at least, in the United States. And in the United States, it's always been, contra what you'll hear from Trump and Steve Bannon and others, it's always been a left-wing egalitarian movement of the people against the big owners of capital. And I think, in other words, that the fight for social democratic demands isn't a separate fight than the fight for socialist demands around ownership. They're part and parcel of the same thing. Perhaps we'll fall short of our loftier ambitions, but we'll still manage to win a more just United States that'll at least have Medicare for all and living wage for all and the chance for decent work for all. But I do think that if we want to live in a society that allows people the opportunity to exercise some sort of democratic voice over their lives, we need to question why a handful of people have so much say and sway over our lives. I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to criticize past forms of communism, for instance, and the idea that a handful of state bureaucrats should have so much power over ordinary people's lives. But I wonder also why we are seemingly content to have a handful of people in corporate boardrooms have so much say over our lives and over the wealth that we socially create. So I guess I'll leave it there. But thank you all for joining me and for bearing with that for the last 45, 50 minutes, an hour. That's been longer than I thought.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar. And we just wanted to turn it over to you guys. If anyone has questions, please feel free to either post in the chat or you can raise your hand and I'll try to come in and pick on you if you'd prefer to speak aloud. Let's see. Kiara, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can get things started. It's Kiara, by the way.
Oh, Kiara, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much, Bhaskar, especially for sharing your hot off the press, freshest thoughts with us. Really appreciate your reasoned and moderate and very realistic sounding approach to laying out a socialist vision. I want to hear more about what you were starting to talk about at the end, which is the question of how do we get there from here? And I really keyed in on a phrase that you mentioned earlier in your talk about infrastructures of dissent. And how creating infrastructures of dissent might make collective action more viable. But I think a full answer to the question of how do we get there from here really addresses not just the agency of those who rise up against the system, but also that handful of people that you were talking about at the end. What happens to the elite? And so I'm thinking especially that you named your magazine the Jacobins, who are of course the faction in the French Revolution who carried out the Reign of Terror, massacres, bloodbath, all of that. So are we to imagine that there's a jailing of the elites, a re-education of the elites, a slaughter of the elites, perhaps some way of getting their buy-in? What's the vision for not just pushing forward the agenda, but what happens to those in the system who are going to resist the change the most and have the most to lose? Thank you so much.
Well, I guess one thing that's worth noting is that, first of all, I should say that initially the inspiration was both the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, and the name is more to invoke, I think, a defense of the Enlightenment and certain ideas that I felt were under attack. So a defense basically of Enlightenment universalism in a world that, in various forms of both left and right, had delved into, I think, the language of particularism. So that was the initial reason for the name, not a defense of murder and attack. Though, I would say that, let's say if you're, I won't ask you your own belief because you're on the clock, but let's assume that you and maybe 60% of the people on the Zoom are advocates of Medicare for all, universal healthcare, and maybe advocates of the bill put forward by Bernie Sanders, and actually I think Kamala Harris was a supporter of that bill, and a host of other people had a lot of support at that bill that advocates the abolition of private health insurance. Now, no one in their right mind, even a Reason editor, libertarian publication editor, would worry about the health and safety of a health industry executive, even though they would resist the decommodification essentially the expropriation of their sector and it being handed over to the state. You might argue whether or not that'd be a good thing or a bad thing for the healthcare system as a whole. But in other words, what would happen to capitalists? Well, they wouldn't be capitalists anymore. Their rights as capitalists would be limited because their right to own private property would be limited by a new laws that prevented them from owning private capital the way they used to own private capital. Then at that point, they would no longer be capitalists. Their rights as human beings, including their right to advocate that they should be allowed to own private capital in the way they used to, I think that's sacrosanct. But their rights as capitalists is something that I think is different than their rights as human beings. So just in the same way that health insurance executives will have to figure out what other sector to work in. And I imagine, by the way, in the transition to socialism, certain capitalist firms might actually be expropriated with compensation dependent on how the road to socialism goes. So for example, in Sweden, during this crisis where capital in the 70s is pushing for a rollback of the system, and the labor movement through the LO is pushing for a deepening of the Swedish social democratic system to something more resembling the socialism that I advocate for, there was a proposal, almost put into effect actually, called the Mitre Plan, that would have created a wage earner fund that would have slowly over time transferred private ownership shares from private Swedish capitalists to the people who worked at those firms through a collective, a little bit more collective than that, through these collective wage earner funds. In a sense, those capitalists were being, compensated because the money, the ownership shares were actually being derived from both taxes they weren't paying and also from deferred compensation from workers. So it might be that some of these will be expropriations with compensation, but again, I would draw the firm line between the rights that we all have as human beings and the rights that we have as owners of capital. And at certain points in history, there has been mass expropriations of certain sectors, including in Britain in the 1940s when their entire health sector was turned over to the state in the late 1940s. In lots of countries where the commanding heights are owned by the state, and it has not led to any sort of insanity or bloodlust and whatnot. But again, I take very seriously the need to reconcile liberalism and socialism.
James?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. It's really helped me organize my pitiful thinking on the subject. Just to give you where my reading has taken me in the last few months is to Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, Thomas Piketty on Capital, Kurt Anderson's Evil Geniuses. He talks extensively about the decline in our social programs, basically from the Lewis Powell doctrine in the 70s, right? But the most interesting, ironically, book that I read was Our Damaged Democracy by Joseph Califano. And he describes a structure of governance that is so firmly entrenched, I can't imagine us I can't imagine Piketty advocating for a more socially aware governance. I can't imagine that happening. This, all of this at the same time, and I would like you to comment on this, I'm seeing the enslavement of America, or because what's happening is the new oil is data. Nobody's getting paid for their data. Companies are creating incredible wealth from free data. Basically, they pay the people enough money to keep them alive, to keep creating data, and it keeps the labor market and wages down, but the data gets provided for free. Isn't that enslavement?
So what I would say is that I'm going to play devil's advocate,
Good.
and I'm not saying I agree with this, but what I would say is that often a lot of people talk about new forms of capitalism, data-driven capitalism or surveillance capitalism or other stuff. But fundamentally, what is being done with the data accumulated by social media companies? Well, they're being aggregated and then used to better target stuff for advertisers, right? So you're targeted with ads, but fundamentally, what I'm saying is that you're buying commodities still produced in the old way, right? So in other words, like, your social media platform is also a platform that you're using to communicate with friends and family and relatives. You know, you're not paying for the servers, you're using the and again, this is just a caveat, not for you, but for like the video 5 years down the road. This somewhat of devil's advocate argument, but you're not getting paid. You're not paying Mark Zuckerberg and the Facebook team for the concept of Facebook, or for the infrastructure to make it work, or for the services to stay in it, and whatnot. So I think their response would be the revenue mechanism to make this free is the data that you're accumulating, but this data is just being used to, and then on my end, this is my argument as a socialist, I'm not convinced that something novel is happening here compared to the status quo of capitalism, because fundamentally the data is being used just to create one really big advertisement platform that is then encouraging you to buy goods that are just produced in factories in China and firms all across the US that are structured in much the same way that every single capitalist firm throughout the late 19th and 20th century firm has been structured. So in other words, I find many of the books that you mentioned interesting, and I didn't actually read the last book. So again, Our Damaged Democracy. So I have no, I might be totally bastardizing the argument, but in general, my inclination is that that the real problem with Facebook is that it's a huge giant company that has a lot of wealth and a lot of say over our democracy. I'm not convinced that there's something particularly novel or devious in and of itself about the way it's accumulating that wealth. I think that the fact that it has that wealth and power is a major problem for our democracy. But my knowledge of this is like, and again, even like what Marxists have been saying about surveillance capitalism and whatnot is extremely, extremely limited. So,
thank you.
Jeanette?
Thanks, Max. Thanks so much, Bhaskar, for joining us. We're so happy to have you here. Welcome to Bard. Thanks for your great thoughts and your great talk. I teach here at Bard, and my question, it really pertains to what you would say to young people who maybe are thinking about how Medicare for All would have kept my family out of medical debt or made my mom's cancer experience so much easier, or they're thinking, wow, I'm really worried about climate change, or man, I could really use a minimum wage hike, right? Or wow, I really got involved in politics over the last kind of 5 years. What would you say to them in terms of what they should do to affect the changes that they'd like to see in the world, ways to plug in, ways to get involved? What would you say to young people who are looking to join the movement?
yeah, well, I think fundamentally, it is important, if you are interested in these ideas, I think, to be part of an organized political group. I'm glad I joined the Democratic Socialist America because it is like broad and ecumenical, and its incoherence, which I used to think was a problem, actually makes it kind of like a, I think, pleasant place to be in, because I think as in all social groups, the more narrow and small and doctrinaire a group is, the harder, the more exhausting it is. So yeah, I'm a member of the Democratic Socialist America. I think people should join it. I think also, assuming that some of the people you're mentioning, if they're students, for example, are college educated or in the chance of getting a college education, well, I think that the key thing is really just having a politics that recognizes the centrality of organized labor in any broad progressive advance. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing you could do, but it does mean that having the worldview that says, okay, like we are all of the same moral and ethical worth as human beings, but if there's 5,000 Amazon workers at a distribution center that decide to go on strike tomorrow, that has a lot of social weight and that has a lot of impact in the world. So I think in a way, I advocate for a labor-centric politics that isn't a way to ignore other people or ignore, let's say, concerns about oppression or other things, but rather becomes the home base for building up a movement. So in other words, traditionally, labor-centered working class movements have in fact been some of the strongest advocates against racism and against forms of sexual discrimination. But that's because it united the people who had the most social weight to actually disrupt production and push certain demands with other people behind that program. So what I would say is that what we can do often is quite limited as, let's say, professionals or as people who are often in very atomized and isolated fields. That doesn't mean that your political views or what you're trying to do is worthless, but it does mean you need to kind of connect with this broader social mass and movement. You know, I'm a writer and an editor. If I go on strike tomorrow, no one would notice. You know, there's about 5 people in my family that would notice. I'm still randomly, my sister is like older than me, is on my cell phone plan for some reason. Like she would notice, but like that's it. 5 people would notice. But the world at large wouldn't. But I can plug into like a labor solidarity action, or I can be a part of the same broader organization, or I can support a broad-based campaign like a Bernie Sanders campaign, or let's say a 2036 Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez campaign. So I would just say, do that, and also just don't get burnt out, because I think the American left is still very small, and we are marathon runners in the quest for social change, not sprinters. It would be very sad to see people just getting interested in politics now get exhausted and kind of quit everything in 2022. So I think it's important that people keep it up and be able to participate in politics and think about these issues, even when they're at stages of their life where it might not be conducive. If they're, having kids, or they're whatever stage of your life. I think the key is to make it a sustainable long-term thing.
Thanks so much.
Amy?
Hi, it is such an honor to be able to speak with you. And I just wanted to ask, since you mentioned it, and I did come in late, so I apologize if I'm asking something you've already discussed. But what do you think socialism has to offer for immigrants fighting for their rights, undocumented, that democratic socialism doesn't?
So, sorry, the last part of your question, socialism has to, yeah.
Sorry, but what do you think socialism has to offer to improve the lives of immigrants and the undocumented? I'm working on something personally about this topic, so I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah. So what I would say is that Well, for one thing, it's kind of hard to say that that question's both easy and hard to answer, and that socialism in the abstract, you know, it would improve everyone's lives because it would create more wealth and abundance in the world and more equally distribute it and guarantee certain social rights. Like, where's the evidence of that? Like, well, I just said so, right? So, but I think at the very least, if you have a conception of socialism that is rooted in democratic organization of people and people organizing for their own self-emancipation and guaranteeing and winning certain universal social rights, for instance, like through the state, then that should benefit all people. Now, how do you prevent a socialism from just benefiting, let's say, people who are established citizens, and having a second tier of people who are basically like guest workers or seasonal laborers that don't have the same access to those social rights? Well, I think it gives us a better chance to create the political environment and a movement where those people can both advocate for their own rights and also so that other people, and also so that, you know, they would already be included in existing legislation, but there's no guarantees for it. But again, in the abstract, like, socialist demands are in general for, you know, universal rights, as far as a social welfare state that should apply for anyone who's working or living in a country. And it also creates a political environment where it's easier to defend those rights and advocate for more. But we shouldn't just take for granted the fact that the most marginalized, let's say, immigrants would be included in any of those structures by default. So some of those might require continued politics and continued fight to do that. But certainly in my worldview as a socialist, you know, I believe in universality and the broadest sense of the world. So I'm not sure if maybe you should follow up, because I'm not sure if I actually answered your question. That was a bit, yeah.
That's okay. I think it's a really broad topic, and I think that well, you'll say, so capitalists will argue, well, immigrants come here so that they can make money and have something to show for it, supposedly, and you know, they'll have more here than they would in their own countries, which is obviously because of, like, oftentimes, like, imperialism and intervention that we've created, like, these, you know, third world countries.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that I actually agree with the basics of the capitalist premise that I think, in other words, there is something that both libertarians, let's say, and Marxists should agree on, which is that when workers come to a country, they are creating wealth, and they're getting some of that wealth too, but they are creating wealth. So in other words, there's a difference between that and a conception of certain, like, Trumpian conservatives and even some liberals. Then when workers come to a country, they're either drains on a welfare state or they're in need of charity, because it's like, you know, a charity cases on the kind of right and the left. Whereas a libertarian would say, no, these people are economic agents who are creating value. And I think Marx would say, yes, they're economic agents creating value. That's why they, but too much of the value they're creating is going to a handful of capitalists that should go back to them in the form of XYZ. And then, so yeah, I guess the key thing is, a socialist would say we need to break down the any barriers between immigrant workers and non-immigrant workers. So they need to be organized in the same trade unions, and we need to have the state regard them as the same. And as long as there's barriers or the stratification of different parts of the working class, the more divided and weaker we would be. So I guess that's the way I would tackle that. So we need to continue to fight against attempts to divide up workers, and that also means that people need rights. You know, they need legalizations. We need to fight for, in the short term, amnesty. Like we need to fight for a liberalization of our immigrant regimes, and we should look at examples that work. So in a country like Switzerland, for example, there was union-back efforts to basically take prevailing wages and to incorporate workers into more centralized, immigrant workers in more centralized bargaining, which essentially just means that you're convincing native-born workers that immigrant labor is actually not hurting them. You know, it's not preventing them from, not a downward pressure on their wage. And that's generally true. In particular sectors, immigrant workers are sometimes exerting downward pressure on native-born workers' wages. But if they're creating wealth in the aggregate, then with state intervention, that wealth that they're creating can easily, help the sectors where they help the workers that they might be exerting a downward pressure on. So again, just like libertarians on this issue, I tend not to think of it as a zero-sum game, and I think that's the one thing I could say to their credit on the libertarian right, how they talk about immigration.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any further questions? Jeff, would you like to expand on your point, or would you like me to read it off for you?
Yeah, just to read it, I think, for the time being, yeah. Well, no, I'm just basically, I'm thinking of, I mean, it sounds really reasonable. That's like, so why haven't we done it already? And maybe it'll happen under our current reasonable administration, although I don't have a high degree of confidence that they'll be able to get very far. Basically, I'm channeling Walter Scheidel, as I often do in these conversations. Who wrote the book The Great Leveler, right? Which with the prodigious amount of historical research, and he's definitely on our side here. I mean, most of his work is in labor movements, but he's a sociologist, not an organizer. That basically, it's wars, basically, and sometimes diseases and revolutions that basically cause enough panic among the rich that they will give anything up. Right? Nobody ever gives up anything. They might give a loan, but they'll call in that loan later. No one ever gives up anything without a physical threat. Really, war is the only really reliable one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that he talks about in that book. So I'm just wondering where, I mean, it's a pretty picture, and I totally want all these things to happen, but where is the muscle behind making it happen?
Well, I mean, in the past, when major reforms in the direction of socialism have been enacted, they've been pushed by mass parties, rooted in millions of people being organized, and often tied to very large trade union federations and other things. So yeah, it definitely requires force and leverage, and yes, it often requires advantageous background conditions. So you could say that, yeah, a lot of the modern welfare states across Europe, for example, were created out of the rubble of World War II. But the parties that created them, most of them were founded in the late 19th century. So it wasn't just you wait until there's some sort of cataclysm or some sort of huge opening, where conditions change so that your politics open. You still have to organize and fight for, what you can. And yeah, I think the other thing we're getting at, realistically, let's say about in the United States, we're in a very unusual situation in that we have a completely defeated workers' movement. We have a very weak left. We have a very hollowed out civil society. So everything from, I am not religious, but like church attendance is like way down, and people don't have the same civic connections with each other. You know, we live more atomized lives. Like there's a lot of reasons why it's very difficult to organize right now. So obviously, we're doing what we can as socialists, fighting for certain demands, fighting to rebuild the labor movement, fighting to organize tenant associations and things like that, and on the margins. But I think that our big breakthrough is coming through electoral politics. And the reason why the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, I think mattered so much was not because of the possibility that Sanders could come in and kind of bring about this program, but because we were at such an impasse that I think it made sense to hope for a figure like Sanders to come in, then from above to galvanize activity from below, for your president to tell you to form a union, for your president to tell you to maybe assemble in local assemblies and debate issues concerning your lives and whatnot. And so I think, in other words, we might need a jolt from above through electoral campaigns, because that's the one form of politics that people still engage in on a year-to-year basis, in order to reinvigorate the type of civil society that might be more conducive for the left as a whole. But in the past, you know, again, like I was saying before, socialist politics has been very effective throughout history. It's kind of a ridiculous thing it sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but if you consider the key demands of even read the end of the Communist Manifesto, the things being demanded, progressive income tax, a democratic state, 40-hour work week. I think at the time the main demand, you know, actually being enacted was the 10-hour bill, which limited the working day to like 10 hours a day. You know, a lot of things have been accomplished, but the social form that sustained left-wing politics from basically the 1860s, 1870s until the 1980s, the Mass Party and the trade union, are both in very rapid decline, and we've had a hard time resuscitating them. And even the working class, even though it still exists more than ever, you know, 60+% of the population you could define as working class. In a objective sense, in a subjective sense, it's not organized, and it sociologically is a very different thing. So it's and also in the same way, when we talk about the crisis of politics, people becoming more apathetic or dropping out of politics, or civil society being in disarray, this is often talked about in very apolitical terms, like this is just something that exists in society. But it's particularly bad for the left, because the left actually needs people engaged in politics and needs people to organize collectively to change things. Whereas if you're a capitalist in favor of the status quo, then you could basically govern with a handful of technocrats. You could govern with the European Central Bank and with, you know, Justin Trudeau and a pretty demobilized population, and you could get like the centrist world that you want. But what we're advocating for, I think, requires a lot more agency and a lot more change. And yeah, a lot of the basic premises of socialist politics, I think, are under challenge just by these sociological changes. I think Marxism as a worldview is still more valid than ever. I think the moral and ethical part of the social worldview is more valid than ever too, but it will create lots of reinvention, and I don't know exactly how the day-to-day politics will pan out.
The part B that I forgot to put in was that if, because it sounds like you're conceding that the situation on the ground is a major factor. So, but when there is a crisis, that will your reasonable program be the one to be enacted? Because then people will be desperate and angry, and they'll want to push their advantage all the way the other direction, and they will risk redoing the 20th century. That was the part I left out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're asking me if I'll be a Kerensky or something. But yeah, I think in general, actually, what we found historically is that crises are often very conservatizing. People often want to go back to old forms of exploitation as long as it means stability. And I think that the popular desire for stability is sometimes underestimated by people on the left. But yeah, again, politics means that nothing's determined. So in the abstract, a crisis could benefit my version of the far left. It could benefit another version of the far left. It could benefit the far right, or it could benefit, and probably will most likely benefit the center. But I think a lot of that contestation will just happen because of politics, and it's very hard to determine ahead of time. I guess the real question is often, how is a crisis being generated? So in other words, what I described, my reading, at least in my book and elsewhere, was kind of more in depth of a large part of the crisis of economic crisis of the 1970s roots a lot of the crisis in the growth of welfare states and the empowerment of labor unions and other contingent factors like the OPEC shock and other stuff, creating a condition where you have declining profitability, declining growth, but you still have these high wage demands, you have inflation growing, you have all these other things. So you have this crisis, but it's formed by, in part at least, in addition to like background factors like the OPEC oil shock and other stuff, caused by labor being too strong. And therefore, the left of trade unions, the left of social democracy, are able to advocate for things like a wage earner proposal and a deepening of social democracy. More socialist currents are kind of emerging out of that crisis. Then you have like the response that's like Blairism and other stuff. Let's like take 5 steps backwards so we don't go all the way back to the 1 yard line. You know, it's like probably the best faith version of third way social democracy, like Blairism, that you could describe. And you have more right-wing kind of crazed and violent solutions to the crisis, like Pinochet's Chile or whatever else. But the bottom line is you have a crisis, but you have a crisis where I think there's at least a possibility of some sort of left resolution. You can't predetermine what that resolution will be like, but I think that's probably a better view of the type of crises we'll have in the future. It'll be, rather than, I think, the truly violent and terrible cataclysms of like World War II and so on. My main thinking is that I would feel pretty confident about the future if not for climate change. If you just take the way that politics has been drifting, people's egalitarian views and the general growth and just like wealth and prosperity, plus frustrated ambitions for security and democracy and whatever else, it seems to me that the left has actually, in a cultural and a social climate and lots of other things, we're actually in a pretty good position right now. But what's going to happen in 20 years when there's mass climate flows of refugees because of climate, and there's all this alarm, and there's a climate of or a environment of instability. So if a relatively small amount of Syrian refugees and refugees from the Middle East could bolster the far right so much in Europe in recent years, what happens when there's similar population flows elsewhere? It seems to me that if the rhetoric of scarcity has worked so well for the right, even when there is no real scarcity, even when it's a lie, what happens when there is real scarcity, at least temporarily? So I think that's the next crisis, and our advocacy has to be for first of all, the rights of human beings, for freedom of movement, but also just for a rational and more planned use of our finite resources, rather than I think, the right-wing populist solution, but I do worry about that. But I feel like that's probably the last question, and that's a terrible way to end things. So I should again emphasize that throughout history, the left has won many important social gains, and we've done so through organizing the capabilities of people at their workplaces and people who never felt like they had these capabilities before. I mean, there has been huge leaps in consciousness before, and we can look to just American history for some of these examples. People who were among the poorest and most marginalized workers in the entire country in the early 1930s were able to win unions and be a part of a successful political coalition by the 30s, and start to win economic and social securities that they never couldn't have imagined. You saw that all across the world. Like, think about the condition of a factory worker in the 1880s, herded into these smokestack factories and living in squalor and slums. Then think, fast forward, 40, 50 years later, and the political parties these people are forming are governing, and they're administrating fairly advanced and developed social democracies. I mean, again, I'm not saying this is the be all end all of history, social democracy, but the transformation is incredible. So I think there is a reading of U.S. history, and there is a reading of world history that does both see the progress, but places at the root of the progress a lot of the self-activity of ordinary exploited and oppressed people. And that's one reason why I sometimes get mad at certain depictions of even US history by more, like, I guess you'd call, like, identitarian parts of the US left, not because I don't see all of the injustice, manifold injustices throughout American history, but because if we have a narrative in which nothing changed, where it starts off as a terrible settler state based on genocide and slavery and violence, then it still is that today, then I think we ignore the fact that even though there's still so much injustice and even though not enough has changed, we have won key and significant victories in the past. And with that knowledge in mind and organizing efforts, we can continue to win those victories too. And even if we fall short of socialism, I think we can guarantee at the very least a society in which people aren't literally dying because they can't afford insulin, or committing suicide because the town they live in hasn't had a decent job for them to have for 5 years, and it feels like no one cares and they have no one to talk to and no outlet of political and social participation. I mean, I think that's something that we can, if we put our minds to it, achieve in the next 10 years.
Well, thank you so much, Bhaskar. That's it was fantastic. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.